was certainly a good turnout. What I would like to do, I think everyone has muted their phones, or there are a couple of people that still not muted their phones. If they could do so, that reduces the likelihood of background phone calls or noise. We do like to use the meeting format so that everybody can participate. And I think Peter, if there's serious questions, they should wait till the end of the presentation. But otherwise, we do look forward to having having good dialogue among the participants. My name is Michael Otten, and I am a co-founder, along with Herb and Peter and others on the call, of a group called Reform Elections Now, which we often abbreviate as REN, which pursues electoral reform on a nonpartisan basis to make our governments more representative and responsive to all voters or all citizens or even residents, to solve problems rather than grandstand with polarizing issues. We had highlighted early in the 2020 election cycle the potential problems that could arise, including the risk of violence around January 6th. We're working on many fronts to improve the fairness and integrity of our elections, to reduce the risk of a worse experience in 2022 or 2024. Our Director of Research, Peter Cyrus, has put together this afternoon what we believe is an eye-opening presentation identifying causes for legislative gridlock that are not being addressed by Congress. There will be time for questions and answers as well as discussion after Peter's thoughtful analysis. We have chosen to make this a meeting rather than a webinar, and I'm glad to see that most people are not even eating their dinner, and most importantly, not sleeping yet. And I don't think they will once we get started. But feel free to submit comments or questions in the chat box, and try to keep your actual Zoom meeting on mute. I hope also that our efforts will motivate you to engage more with us, because we really need to find ways to make our political systems and government work better in the future. We do have meaningful initiatives likely to reach fruition in 2022, but we will need your support to mobilize effective action. Peter, I think have already heard Peter and know he is a wonderful, articulate and clear-speaking spokesman for our group. He has written case studies at Harvard Business School and taught there. And he's authored novels as well as a best-selling book on doing business in China. Without further ado, I will let Peter take over and carry it from there. And I think, Herb, you arranged for the sharing of screen so we can get right into the presentation.
Yes, Peter.
Herb, I got sharing a screen.
You're a co-host. You can share the screen.
Okay, well, it's very exciting. Let me see if I can get the presentation up. Well, bear with me.
This is merely to build suspense.
What?
This is merely to build the suspense as we wait.
Why did I send this link to you guys? So you could post it. Well,
You could do that, but
Where's the music, Peter?
hold on one second.
I'll mute again.
Yeah.
if you have a problem, we can do that because we do have the presentation.
I know you do. That's okay. I'm having Why don't one of you guys try to get it up? Because I am having trouble getting the presentation up.
I'm just loading it now. Let's see if I can get it shared.
Sorry, everybody.
Peter, you know where the presentation is, right? On your computer?
Yes.
All
Okay,
right, does it come up now?
here we
Did
go.
it come up?
Yes,
Okay, I'm using my version then.
Okay.
Peter, you'll tell me when to page.
Sorry. I apologize. I don't know what happened here, but okay, let's go. Okay, today we're going to talk about these omnibus bills, how they increase polarization, alienate voters, and hurt democracy. Next page. Can you? Okay, now at HBS, the rules of marketing are pretty simple. Keep it simple, stupid, know your product, know your customer, provide clear, targeted messages for each product. Next. Now, how do corporations market? Procter & Gamble does not say, hey, we got the devil buried in our logo, so buy every one of Procter & Gamble products. It runs separate ads for Bounty, the quicker picker-upper. Mr. Clean gets rid of grease and grime in just a minute. Tide, get your clothes Tide clean. Gillette, for the best shave the man can get. Now, Pfizer does not run ads and say, we make lots of drugs, go buy drugs today. It runs separate ads for Eliquis, I got AFib, Lipitor, I got high cholesterol, COVID, I need a shot, and Viagra, whatever that is. Now, a 12 to 7-year-old looking for a COVID shot is probably not also looking for Viagra, although with maybe 16 to 17-year-olds they are, I don't know. But consumers like to know exactly what they're buying and why. Next page. Now let's look at how Congress markets things. When Congress markets to voters, it ignores all the rules. Instead of creating bills customers can understand, it creates these opaque omnibus bills. The current Congress has introduced a series of bills like H.R. 1 for the people, Build Back Better, and others. The names seem nice, but these bills are so complex that few understand their content or cost. Voters are given a dream, not specific policies that will help them. Negotiations are not between Democrats and Republicans. I mean, what do you hear all day? Well, it's Manchin and Sinema. People are never going to forget those two. And the AOC between the progressives and the moderates. Now, these bills could pass, although H.R. 1, the For the People Act, thus far has failed. But no matter the outcome, these bills are going to hurt democracy, and voters are going to continue to lose faith in government. Partisanship will become more extreme, and both parties will be hurt. Next. Now, the HR1, the For the People Act, sits in limbo. There's some new act, HR4, the John Lewis Act, which is slightly less opaque, but pretty close. On March 3rd, the 800-page Omnibus For the People Act passed the House with all Democrats voting for it and all but one Republican voting against it. The bill went to the Senate, where the Democrats knew they faced a filibuster. It is sat dormant for 8 months. Even the right-wing New York Times said the For the People Act was a flawed bill that had little chance of testing the limits of what, if anything, is still possible in Washington. Now, if the New York Times thinks it's a flawed bill without a chance of passing, God knows what the Republicans are going to think. Meanwhile, the Republicans in state after state have passed targeted legislation that runs counter to the goals of HR1 and makes voting more difficult. HR1 included many elements a majority of voters of both parties supported, such as getting foreign money out of elections and improving registration. Yet while Republican bills in state after state have become law, the For the People Act sits in limbo. Next. Now, the current omnibus bill before Congress is Build Back Better, a 3.5 trillion, 1,065-page bill. Now, between the time I wrote this presentation and today, the bill has changed many times. It could be 3.5 trillion, 2 trillion, 1.6 trillion. I have no clue. However, for the purposes of today's discussion, we are going to focus on the original bill. And before looking at the content of this bill, we are going to have a short poll. We are going to list a number of programs and ask each of you to select which of these is in the original bill. Next. Okay, so we're going to start with parks, energy, education, employment, and Native America. And we have wildlife service funding for trails, national forest restoration and fuels reduction, rural energy, biofuels, clean energy repowering rural utilities, urban agriculture, free community college, tuition assistance for students at Black College, Pell Grants, investments in historically Black college, reentry opportunities for ex-offenders, registered apprenticeship, Job Corps, Native American programs, migrant and seasonal farm worker programs, youth build programs. Okay, pick the ones that are in that.
Go to 549 Harlem Line train to Southeast, stop at Harlem on 25th Street, then going express to White Plains and making all stops from White Plains to Southeast.
Who's ever going to White Plains, can you mute yourself?
For Valhalla, Pleasantville, and
okay. For
Hold on a
whoever's going to
second.
Valhalla, can you mute yourself? Thanks. Next page. Okay, these are seniors, childcare, pre-K, pregnancy, electric, and clean air. And we have senior community service employment program, get those seniors back to work, childcare, universal pre-K, child nutrition, family violence prevention, pregnancy assistance fund, funding for the aging network and infrastructure, rebuilding the electric grid, heavy duty vehicles, reduce air pollution at ports, greenhouse gas reduction, diesel emissions reduction, lead service line replacement for drinking water, clean electricity, building efficiency and resilience, and zero emissions vehicle infrastructure. Okay, pick the ones that are in that. Next page. Health insurance, supply chain, and housing. We have health insurance affordability, long-term care for older Americans, closing the Medicaid gap, children's health insurance program, Medicare coverage of dental, hearing, and vision, giving Medicare and Medicaid the right to negotiate drug prices, children's tax credit, paid family leave, funding to support public health infrastructure, supply chain resistance, affordability, housing for the 21st century sustainable and equitable communities, lead paint and hazard mitigation, home ownership investments. Okay, pick those. Next page. This is immigration, small business, and climate. permanent residence for certain residents for certain entrants, modification of visas, increasing federal contracting opportunities for small businesses, empowering small businesses, offshore wind for the territory, climate conservation court, urban park, every kid outdoors, park service, climate resilience, drought response and preparedness, water reclamation, water technology and reuse investment, passenger rail improvement and modernization, Great Lakes icebreaker, I'm for that one, sewer overflow and stormwater reuse grants. Okay, pick the ones that are there. Next. I know you get the message, Jean-Louis, so I won't read all the taxation one, but these are all the ones in taxation. Next. And here's some more taxation. Okay, so these are all the things, including tax changes targeted at crypto, valuation rules for transfers of non-business assets, etc. Okay, now I want you all to vote by number for the policies here that are in Build Back Better. I'll give you a second to mark your ballots.
Where do we vote, Peter?
Just mark your ballots and get ready to vote. Then we'll tell you where to vote.
Where do we vote?
Just
I
relax.
don't know where to mark the ballot.
Just mark the ballot. Let's go to the next page.
There's no ballot to mark.
I just was informed by Herb Kaplan, who's our master poller, that we didn't pay our Zoom bill. And that Zoom allows us only 10 choices. So unfortunately, we have to cancel the poll. I apologize to everybody. But since we cannot have the poll, we're going to give you the correct answers. If you voted for 1, 2, and 3, you're correct. If you voted for 4, 5, and 6, you're correct. In fact, if you voted for all 85 choices, you get 100%. However, there are actually many more than 85 items, but we only had a short period of time for this call, and I got tired of typing up the choices. So this bill is so complex, and the negotiation for what is or is not included has been so opaque that whatever occurs, the impact on American democracy will be negative. So let's look at the issues with these omnibus bills. Next. Most Americans do not understand what is in the bill, which is further alienating them from government. Look, if no bill passes, Democrats will have wasted their opportunity. If a bill passes, either the moderates or the progressives are going to be disappointed. And in either case, voters are going to be left in the dark with no way to indicate their preferences. Republicans will have opposed many policies they support because they're focused on opposing Democrats, not governing. Partisanship will continue to increase. And when the Democrats run in 2022 and 2024, they're going to have a difficult time articulating what they've done for the American people. Now, Republicans also may have a difficult time, but at least they've got Stop the Steal, Build a Wall, and Make America Great Again. But one way or another, government is going to become more deadlocked. Next page. Now, the first and largest problem with the omnibus bills is that nobody understands what's in them. According to a recent CBS YouGov poll, only 10% of Americans thought they knew a lot of the specifics, as compared to 28% who knew none and 29% who had no clue on what was in the bill. We suspect that even 10% could be overstating the knowledge. And look, 3.5 trillion is a lot of money to spend on a bill that nobody understands what's in it. Next. Now, even more significant, when asked, only 36% said the expenditure of 3.5 trillion would help them or the economy. 33%, almost the same amount, said it would hurt, and 31% said it would have no impact. Now, what does this tell you? People react to specific benefits, not to big think concepts. When you go to the gas station and see gas at, $5 a gallon, that's real. When somebody tells you we're creating a climate conservation corps, that's a concept. It's not real. Next. Now, the other problem is critical bipartisan elements can get buried. Earlier this week, Mike Otten and I had a conversation with two of the top constitutional scholars in the United States, Ned Foley of Ohio State and Rick Pildes of NYU. And we asked, what's the greatest threat to democracy? And they responded that the loopholes in the Election Acts of 1845 and 1887, which Mike was around to help write those things, as well as in the 12th and 20th Amendments, could lead to disputed elections and a constitutional crisis. And they noted that neither Democrats nor Republicans want a constitutional crisis or a disputed election. And there was bipartisan support for fixing these loopholes. So Mike asked, okay, what's happening in Congress? And these guys looked at each other and said, well, it's somewhere in the John Lewis, the HR 4 John Lewis Voting Rights Amendment Advancement Act of 2021. But because that bill is also so complex, it's not going to pass. So thus, we're risking disputed elections and a constitutional crisis because simple but critical legislation is buried in the omnibus bills. And incidentally, we're going to have a presentation on this subject of constitutional crisis in the next several months. If you're on the phone, please mute. Next page. Now, the Democrats are risking everything on the omnibus bills. The For the People Act has already failed, leaving Democrats with no major accomplishments, while Republicans have passed legislation in many states. If Build Back Better fails, Democrats will be left with no singular accomplishments except for infrastructure bill, which could take a while before it impacts individual Americans. Negotiations between moderate and progressive Democrats have lowered the support for the party and the president. And if Build Back Better is passed, Democrats will not get much credit because few voters understand what's in the bill. And by the time they realize, oh, this was good, Democrats will have lost their slim majority. So depending on what is ultimately included in Build Back Better, either progressives, Democrats will have disappointed voters, or moderate Democrats will lose their seats. Next. Now, approval rates, we believe there is a correlation between omnibus bills and Democrats' popularity. Since the Democrats embarked on this omnibus strategy, polls have shown strong negative reaction. Biden's popularity has plunged. A recent Suffolk poll has Biden at 38% with a disapproval of 59%. Of course, he's the most popular. Kamala Harris, her popularity reading was 28%. And the Democrats in Congress, their approval rating is 12% with a disapproval rating of 75%. 64% of the people think the country is moving in the wrong direction, and only 27% think it's moving in the right direction. The intent of these omnibus bills is not registering on voters. Next. While Republicans will benefit from Biden's lack of popularity and the view that the country is moving in the wrong direction, they may not be better off because they've sat on the sidelines. They've been very good at articulating negative positions like stop the steal, build the wall, and make America great again. However, if Build Back Better fails, Democrats can blame Republicans for opposing lowering drug prices, leaving the elderly without long-term care, stopping actions to improve the electric grid or modernizing schools, and refusing to even debate on some of the most important legislation in decades. If it passes and is successful, Democrats will get credit for the new programs. So how are the Republicans going to justify their complete inaction? Next. But here is the most important point. Great legislation is usually bipartisan. Look at things like Social Security, the Interstate Highway Act, the Civil Rights Act, Medicare, food stamps, Social Security reform, Tax Reform Act of 1986, ADA, or welfare reform. These were all passed with bipartisan majority. The only recent legislation that was passed with only one party was the ACA, or Obamacare. And when the other party gained control, all you heard was repeal and replace. Next. So when omnibus bills have the support of one party, cooperation between the parties ceases to exist. Instead of working together to legislate in the interests of all Americans, the two parties become islands fighting each other. With bills too complex for voters to understand, the public becomes increasingly alienated from its elected officials, and the two parties continue to war over issues few understand. Next. Now, if these bills are so confusing, increase partisanship, stalemate government, and fail to do what politicians, want, then why do politicians continue to introduce them? And the answer is partisan politics. Look at any omnibus bills, and you will see buried inside it issues that have little relation to the bill and that have no chance of passing unless they're hidden in the bill, too complex for people to understand. Now, this is the politicians' way of saying, hey, right now we have power. In the next election, the next election works against us. We're going to lose our chance. So let's pack everything we can now and go for the big win. In sports parlance, we call this strategy a Hail Mary. Next. Now, HR 1 has many sections that would improve our elections, but Democrats snuck in sections that would be deal breakers. Granting statehood to the District of Columbia and giving territories the right to vote. I mean, states have always been passed separately, and obviously the Democrats like this. All the people in DC and in the territories, or most of them, are Democrats. Presidential tax transparency, making presidential candidates release 10 years of tax returns. Who do you think that's directed to? Presidential conflicts of interest, making government officials divulge conflicts of interest. Who do you think that's? Hey, same name, Donald Trump. Executive branch ethics reform. I mean, when you read through these things, it's let's get back at Trump, we're still pissed. And congressional redistricting reform. And here's the point. They want to come up buried in a 1,000-page bill is something for congressional redistricting reform, completely bypassing the states. Next. Now, we have sleight of hand in Build Back Better. I mean, wildlife funding for trails, urban agriculture, tuition assistance for students at Black colleges, migrant seasonal farm workers programs. I mean, I'm not going to read them all, but when every kid outdoors, my favorite, the Great Lake icebreaker. I mean, offshore wind for the territories. When Americans think of the great problems that face our country, three things they probably don't think about are Great Lakes icebreakers, offshore wind for the territories, and every kid outdoors. Next. So the question is, instead of having one large omnibus bill like HR 1 or Build Back Better, why can't Congress consider splitting these bills into many parts and allowing voters and politicians to have their say on each of the items? voters could signal their preferences. Leaders of both parties could work together, and Congress might finally be able to accomplish something. Next. Now, here's what's interesting. If you look at Build Back Better and you look at individual things, 88% of people are in favor of lowering prescription drug prices. 84% are in favor of Medicare coverage for dental, eye, and hearing. 73% of people for paid family leave, 67% for universal pre-K. Next. And when we really drill down onto the numbers by party, here's what you see. Let's take long-term care for seniors and allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Long-term care for seniors is supported by 75% of Republicans, with only 17% opposed. Letting Medicare negotiate drug prices, 63% of Republicans, with only 24% opposed. I mean, these are things that a vast majority of Americans are in favor of. Very little opposition. I mean, does anybody really think Mitch McConnell wants to run for re-election on the platform of telling voters that he had opposed long-term care for their parents? Does Marco Rubio really want to tell seniors in Florida that he voted for them to pay for higher drug prices? If these two policies were placed in single bills, they would likely pass with strong support from both parties. Next. And there are other things here. Let's look at support for modernizing the electric grid. I mean, you have Republicans, 65% of Republicans support modernizing the electric grid with only 25% opposed. 66% support modernizing school buildings with only 25% opposed. Now, you think Louisiana's 2 senators, the state has been blacked out for 2 months since Hurricane Ida. Are they going to vote against modernizing the electric grid? I don't think so. Are senators from rural states going to vote to deprive students from being able to attend schools that are not falling apart, or schools that have internet? I don't think so. Next. Now, one actually might expect taxation to be a very controversial issue, but 64% of everybody, including a significant majority of Republicans, support making the wealthiest pay more. And 66% of people, even more, support increasing the capital gains rate. And Republicans support this 54-38. Given the level of bipartisan support, it's likely that a few Republican senators and House members would support some of these tax proposals. Now, I'm using these 4 examples because I was able to get polling numbers by party on these things. I am sure there are plenty of other subjects in this bill that have similar bipartisan majorities. Next. Now, so the question is, why can't government introduce bills aimed at solving one problem at a time? Suppose instead of Build Back Better, Democrats introduce separate bills for providing long-term care, allowing Medicare to negotiate drug costs, modernizing the electric grid, modernizing school buildings, raising taxes on the wealthy, and increasing the capital gains rate. Each of these would be easy to vote for voters to understand. Each would pass with the support from both parties, and once passed, each would be popular with voters. Voters would feel the country was moving in the right direction, and members of Congress would feel they could work across the aisle to solve problems. With a number of major well-defined bills passed and voters feeling more optimistic, the party in control, in this case the Democrats, could introduce more legislation that could be supported by both parties. Next. Now, just think of other things like rural energy savings, universal pre-K, funding the aging network and infrastructure, Medicare coverage for dental, hearing, and vision, which we cited before, and a whole bunch of other things, water reclamation, passenger and rail improvement, there's limiting interest deductions for multinationals, tax charges targeted at cryptocurrencies, including wash sales. There's a lot of stuff that the polling indicates that large majorities of both parties support, and yet we can never get to focus on these bills. Next. So in conclusion, what we're suggesting is we take every single congressperson and make them go to Harvard Business School for 1 semester and take marketing courses. And what they're going to learn is keep it simple, stupid. Don't make the laws too complex to understand. Know your products, provide laws that voters can understand. Know your customer. Listen to the voters who elected you. Provide clear messages. Explain to voters why each law is important and what it will cost. And target messages to clearly define consumers. Explain to voters how the laws will impact their lives. If Congress focuses on marketing to voters instead of on developing bills too complex for anyone to understand, it may find that the two parties can work together to solve problems impacting our country. So that's it. I'll shut up now. And I know there's been a lot of comments. So Mike, you want to take that away and we'll go back to the questions.
Well, I'll jump in and
Figure out how.
then Mike will come in due course. There was a comment that was just made by one of the participants. If
Or
these-
why don't you take the presentation down and then,
yeah,
or Mike?
Mike, take the presentation down.
I'm trying to do that.
Okay,
It's near the
Okay.
top, I think.
I got it. Okay.
Not sharing. So one of our participants said, if it's so complex, so complicated to introduce an omnibus bill, are the Democrats stupid, or do they, or why are they doing this? Do they think that they would run out the clock if they try to do it individually, or why do you think they're doing this?
oh, that's the answer to that is very simple. The progressives in the Democratic Party know that the only way to sneak some of this stuff through that's on the left-hand side is to shove it into some bill that nobody understands. I mean, the thought that a bill needs bipartisan majorities to pass, the stuff that's in the middle that impacts everybody is bipartisan. But what the Democrats are doing is the progressives have thrown a lot of stuff in there that by itself would have no chance of passing. One example, can somebody tell me how immigration reform fits in Build Back Better? I mean, there is in Build Back Better all sorts of clauses for making people, for giving people citizenship and changing visa regulations. Now, the reality is that stuff you put in a separate bill, it's dead. You bury it in Build Back Better, somebody may not notice.
Okay, so that presumes that progressives who wanted to work this way thought that there was a way that they were going to get this passed. We have almost 50 people on the call, and I think in order to keep some kind of order, if you have a question, there are two things that you can do. You can enter it into the chat box, and we'll get to it. The other thing is, if you go to the participants panel, there you have the ability to raise your hand, and we'll see the icon and call on you.
Does everybody know where the raise hand is?
I'm unable to find it.
Okay, if you don't, look at the bottom of your screen, there's something called reactions. And if you click on reactions, there's thumbs up, thumbs down, a heart, and all sorts of things. At the bottom, it says raise hand. If you click on raise hand, your hand will be raised and then Herb will call on you.
Lee Backus. Unmute yourself, Lee.
You gotta,
Lee,
Lee, you have to unmute yourself.
unmute yourself, Lee. Lee, you're still muted.
Lee, in the bottom, 2 years of Harvard Business School teaches you a lot, but it doesn't teach you how to unmute yourself.
Oh, yeah, you're right. There we go. It reminds me of that commercial on. Okay, what I don't understand is with these complicated omnibus bills, the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, is analyzing them to come up with how much they are going to cost. How do they do that?
Well, that's an interesting question because the omnibus bills change on a daily basis. And by the time they get in front of Congress, Joe Manchin or somebody is going to say, oh, we don't want the tax on pigs in Arkansas or whatever. And so then they have to recalculate it. And the reality is, with a multi-trillion-dollar deficit, who the heck cares anyway?
Manchin does.
I'd
Well,
like
somebody.
to
somebody-
call on Earl Sedlick.
Yeah, let's give preference to Section E. We have a very good turnout. We have a very good
I'll
turnout.
make it
for
short. I'll
Section
make
E.
it short. The premise here is that the Congress would like the people to understand the bills and that they would like the people's support. I wish that were true.
No, the premise is they don't. Congress doesn't want people to understand the bills.
But you're saying that if we made it simpler, then they would understand it. I
Yes.
think okay, so let me back up then. The reality is that the Congress and people are paid by lobbyists for lots of different companies and firms and passions, and they're going to follow that support, the financial support, and not these specific elements. The other reason why there's 85 or more things is that everybody can see something in there they like, or they can be blamed if they don't pass it because there was something in there for their people, so to speak. I don't think they care about what's in there for their people. And you're right, they're trying to hide some things. But on the other hand, there's a one-shot only process they have this year because they need to do this under the guise of a extension of the financial, whatever that phrase is called, budgetary reform. So omnibus bills that we see are created in that context. I don't think they would always be that way. The other part is that we are in a period that is horribly partisan and locked down. And you're right, the Republicans are only there to say no, and we'll see what happens when they're in charge.
And how do you get around, Earl, just since you brought it up, this idea that the lobbyists for the drug companies are going to, 86% of people want Medicare and Medicaid to negotiate drug prices. There are only, 12 people in the United States that don't want drug prices negotiated, and they're all senior executives in drug companies.
Ken Brassfield.
I was actually just testing the system, Herb. But now that I've got it works. I just thought I'd mention something, and I imagine every single one of you knows that the big companies have access that the ordinary person does not. So without mentioning names, because I've been involved in a little bit of this, if they want to get their point of view to a secretary, a department secretary, they can make an appointment with the assistant secretary of that department to the next day, and they could go in and they'll tell that story knowing that their point of view is going to get to the secretary. And so I'll just close out with that observation from personal experience.
Yeah, I do apologize. One of the areas that I left out in the Build Back Better bill was that all Americans were going to get 2 meals a week of Nantucket scallops.
It's a bad harvest, Peter. And
Oh.
they're very expensive.
Ken is the capo de capo of Nantucket scholarship.
Peter,
Scallops.
you don't want the group to think that REN is a wholly owned subsidiary of Section E now, do we?
Let's move on. Mark Hecht.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is there anyone out there who is actually familiar with the process that produced legislation like Build Back Better? Specifically, who is it that is proposing and formulating and drafting and directing the formulation of these policies? Clearly, it could not be President Biden. I don't think there is anyone out in this group that believes he has the mental capacity to do that. And is it congressional representatives like the Squad, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ilhan Omar, and others who are doing it, except that when they make statements about economics and about tax policies, it's pretty darn clear that they don't have a clue what they're talking about. So just who is formulating this omnibus legislation? I confess I have a guess, but I don't want to state it at this point. I'd wonder what others think.
What is your guess?
My guess is that it's being directed from Martha's Vineyard by former President Obama, and by people like Valerie Jarrett and Susan Rice at his direction. I say that because the hallmarks of everything that this administration has introduced are so much like the Obamacare bill that was introduced in 2010 with what I believe was mostly political objectives. The political objectives in 2009 being the political objectives being to try and garner victory in the 2010 elections. That's only a suspicion. I have no sources of any merit that have validated that, or that I've even I don't have any sources with whom I might discuss that, but maybe some of you people do.
Peter, do you have
That move didn't work at all in 2010.
I'm sorry?
I say that move didn't work at all in 2010.
It did actually. It got the legislation passed. The move to get victory in the 2010
That's what I mean.
elections, of course, failed pretty badly, but it did get two tremendously complex and, in my case, in my humble opinion, two horrid pieces of legislation, namely the Dodd-Frank law and Obamacare, both passed.
Paul Sarno, unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Paul. Go ahead.
Peter, don't you think that the tax provisions that are in the budget reconciliation or that are in the BBB, the Build Back Better, are designed to make it into a budget reconciliation measure because the Democrats have figured out properly, I think, that they're going to get virtually zero support in the Senate. Mitch McConnell will not permit any Republican senator to vote for the bill. And the only chance of this bill passing, whatever its provisions are, is that it's a budget reconciliation bill, and that therefore you need provisions that pay for it, at least in major part.
No, I think that's a very reason. I mean, yes, I think you're right. I guess the question I'm asking is, should our major policy, this is like the budget reconciliation piece is like a trick. I mean, shouldn't there be a way of enacting policies that are not, part of some game like budget, reconciliation? And I understand the reason for it is because of the filibuster.
Absolutely.
But if the Democrats found a way to do away with the filibuster and the Republicans won the next election, then we'll spend the next 2 years undoing whatever game was done this year, which is not moving forward.
Richard Kane.
That's why nobody wants to touch the filibuster rule right now.
Yes.
Mm.
So, Peter, in most Harvard Business School case discussions, we get to the question, or we actually start with the question about what should they do. So I'm in total agreement with your presentation as a statement of fact, but I haven't heard a word on how do we get something done? How do we get the Democrats to decide that there is a high probability of passing 3 or 4 specific bills, and therefore they should give up on a very low probability that they will pass the omnibus bill?
Dean, look
How
at
do
Rich.
we get that done?
Well, if you remember, I sat in the back row and was sleeping through a lot of those cases. So, I'm probably not the right guy to ask. But no, but obviously I'm making a joke because there were a few classes I didn't sleep through. But I'd be interested to hear, from, I have answers, but I'd be interested to hear if other people, if other people have ideas on how we can get the parties to work, how we can get the parties to simplify things so that voters can understand what they're doing and so that you can get bipartisanship. I mean, the comment that was made a minute ago that Mitch McConnell will not let any Republican senators break rank to vote for something. As I said, if it was rebuilding the electric grid, you can bet that the senators in Louisiana are going to vote to rebuild the electric grid. They've had 2 months of blackouts. And my view is that the way they're doing things leads to this kind of all or nothing.
But the challenge, Peter, is that the 3 or 4 bills that you described, which would get vast approval across the country, the progressives won't support that if it means giving up on all the stuff that they really want.
Right. So basically what you're saying is the progressives would rather have nothing.
It seems that way.
Progressives would rather have nothing than some simple things like, some simple things like the ability to negotiate drug prices or something like that. That's your point of view, right?
And that would obviously help all the people that support the progressives in a big way, but it's not high on their list.
Right.
Things they want to
Peter,
get.
there's another problem too, besides that one, when you get into any proposal that most people will support, and you might get 60 senators to support, the question is, what does it cost? And I have rarely heard any Republican say, okay, we're going to raise some taxes. What I hear from the Republican side is, oh my God, it'll decrease the deficit and we don't want any taxes increased. I agree that progressives are a problem, and that idea that we don't want any taxes increased, and we certainly don't want the budget deficit to grow.
No, I mean, you're completely right. But again, as I showed in the slide, there were areas where Republicans and Democrats agreed on some taxation issues. I mean,
Republican people, not Republican representatives.
well, but for example, I mean, this is just like a funny one, but take the idea of taxing cryptocurrency capital gains, watch sales. I mean, I gotta believe that there's some Republican senator somewhere, in North Dakota, they don't know what cryptocurrency is. I gotta believe that, some of those places, you're gonna have Republicans step up and say, yeah, I mean, who's playing cryptocurrency anyway? They're all Democrats.
You have to know if there's a lobbyist. If there's a lobby, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I now call on Tom Gross? And Tom, unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Tom.
I'm on a call. I'm on a little speak here.
Whoever's got the phone call in the background, put yourself,
Yeah,
please.
can we stop that call by any chance? Oh,
Go
this
ahead,
way.
Tom.
Yeah, Peter, thank you so much for your remarks, and it added a sense of further gloom and doom to my view on where we are as a democracy and as a country. I hadn't, until you laid it out so clearly, appreciated the complete disorientation and incompetency of the left and the split on the left. And and what we see on the right is so dangerous. It's almost like the Keystone Cops versus the Nazis, to put it in metaphoric terms. And I just kind of meeting a bunch of folks here I've never met. I wonder if I'm just being too extreme, but I kind of feel that we're going to see things unravel more than we're going to see the possibility of the kind of bipartisanship that you were envisioning, Peter. And when you said it, I had another metaphor, forgive me. It sounded like at the gunfight of the OK Corral, we're all old enough to remember that movie perhaps, but these opposing forces are walking toward each other to have a shootout. And that was not a moment for, let's figure out a bipartisan way to deal with this. I fear that we're past the point of a potential for bipartisanship. And it's a very dark view, but I just wanted to test it. Am I alone?
Can I comment here, perhaps? I don't think you're alone by any means, Tom, but I do think there is quite a bit of reason to believe that there is progress being made. There are an increasing number of groups, some of them with genuine influence, others without, who are trying to figure out ways to wake up the Congress to recognize that the people are not just unhappy, but they're going to stop re-electing people who can't deliver anything but attacks on the opposition. I think there are groups that are beginning to recognize that. I hope that business will in some ways be the leaders for that, because businessmen generally don't have to be reelected in order to continue doing good business. And furthermore, they're generally pretty loyal Americans who don't just believe in slogans, but recognize that our democracy is at risk, or our republic is at risk, even if you don't want to buy into full democracy. There's certainly a lot of aspects to our republic that are going to go down the tubes if we continue to have this polarization and get nothing done. So I'd like to believe that there are grounds for being optimistic. The number of people that are on this and other calls we've had, and most of our other calls have been oriented more towards action items rather than problems being explained. And I do think there is traction that's occurring, but it is slow. Change does not come easily. I think most of us have learned or studied business transformation and realized that's not easy either. And this is a big business and it's not being managed very well. And they're not listening to the outside consultants at this point.
I just want to mention Linda Sweeney had a comment which says, isn't the purpose of this group to reform the election process to elect more compromisers? Why don't you mention this as a solution? And you know, I mean, I think that's certainly the reason I wanted to have this discussion today is really to show people how much we think there needs to be people who are willing to work together between the two parties so that we can make progress. I mean, I see a couple of comments here, you know, from Ken Brasfield and Mary Flannery, who's basically saying, I think Tom is correct. And you know, and our view is, you know, we have to realize what the problems are and act now to try to help solve them, whether it's changing some of the voting systems, whether it's supporting candidates who will work across the aisle, you know, whether it's things like ranked choice voting or nonpartisan primaries, open primaries, ending gerrymandering. The fact of the matter is that our country is getting too polarized and each side is learning how to play these games that basically make our government less effective.
I would also want to mention that that there is this the 13 congressmen that voted for the Infrastructure Act. Most of them, if not all of them, are part of this Problem Solvers Caucus, which is an effort that's been pressed by an outside group called No Labels, which is trying to get these groups to work together on common efforts, and has succeeded in effect in this particular instance.
And almost
the backlash from the two extremes, both sides, both the progressives and the far right extremists, have been horrifying, but they are unfortunately a part of the symptoms that we do have to address. And I'm glad that there are still politicians with the courage of their convictions.
And of the 13, what are the odds that, how many of them are going to be in the next Congress? 1, 2, or 3?
That's why it takes guts to do that.
I would bet more on 6 or 7. And I do think that there's going to be at some point a backlash. I hope it happens before it becomes a violent revolution.
I see that Earl has his hand raised again. Earl, did you want to make a point?
You're on mute, Earl.
I'm trying to unmute there. I just wanted to say a lot of some points. Number one, I object when somebody has any reference to a Nazi on either side. That should never be said. I know you didn't intend to offend anybody, but that offends everybody. Secondly, the omnibus strategy is really a unique opportunity for the Democrats because they have to use the budget restructuring program, and they have to get everybody on board. So Mark asked, who's responsible? A woman from Seattle is responsible. She's my congressman, she's liberal, and she runs the Progressive Caucus. And essentially, that strategy is put every and anything you want into this, because we are not going to vote for the infrastructure bill unless we get support for these other causes. They stood firm for a long time. This is where they are. They got the promise that by this weekend, they would have a vote in Congress on that bill. We'll see what happens. The other side of it is, yeah, it's omnibus with the idea that there will be compromise. They already have compromise, and they're going to drop a lot of things that should be in there that they want to have, with the hope that they get some of them. And they are facing death sentence. If they don't get this passed this year, this will never happen. And this shadow will last for a long time. So the issue that Peter pings up is perfect. Everybody wants the Medicare to negotiate their prices. It's in there. Damn it, you want that in there? Vote for everything else. If you don't, it's not going to happen for another 8 years. So that's the background there. And I think it's unfortunate because that's what Trump has laid out for everybody. And the shadow background is that he's still saying he's the president. So you have Republicans who won't compromise for fear of being primaried and forgotten. And Peter, you made that point. So we're facing a real clash, and I just hope it stays, shall I say, in the news rather than on the streets.
You know, I'll step in. Whatever the House passes in the Build Back Better bill has got to go to the Senate, and it's not going to pass. Whatever the House comes up with is not going to pass. It seems to me that we're in for an uncertain period where what will it take to get Manchin and Sinema and all the other Democrats to agree on something. And it might happen, but it also might happen that it might take a long time of talk and debate among the Democrats in the Senate. And then there'll be back and forth between the Senate and the House. And this can go on for a long, long time. And who knows what, if anything, will eventually pass before the midterms.
May I just quickly apologize, Herb, to Earl and anybody else I may have offended with the metaphor that I used? I'm sorry for that.
Thank you. Mark, you have your hand.
Two things, or maybe three. First, I'm not at all optimistic about the prospect for change going forward. Second, if there were one thing that your group might advocate for that might realistically make a difference, I think it would be the imposition of real strict term limits. The politicians in Washington, just like the politicians in my state of Illinois, are much more interested in keeping their very lucrative jobs than they are in getting anything done. And the way things are set up, keeping that job or their jobs means pandering to a lot of influence groups. Just the ones that, for instance, in Illinois, carry the votes so that we have an entirely Republican state except for Cook County and Sangamon County, which is in Springfield, and they pander to the voters. Finally, as much as it may not be to your liking, in the short term, if there's one thing that might just do some good for this process, I think it would be if Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema hold their ground, and vote down don't agree to any compromise, vote down the entire Build Back Better program, and force the Senate and the Congress to get back to something like the old way of introducing legislation, which is exactly what you want. First, bite-sized pieces. Second, real conference and negotiation. Third, legislation that is actually read and, to some degree or other, understood by the people who are voting on it. And that's why I'm hoping that Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema will stand their ground and do the right thing for their country. We'd all benefit from it in the long run. Thank you. That's all.
I just want to say that the government there's one difference between Congress and the state of Illinois. The state of Illinois has in my view, brilliant system of accomplishing term limits, which is, and my numbers may be off, but I believe 4 of the last 6 governors of Illinois served time in the big house, in jail.
That's true.
So,
That's true.
So putting Blagojevich and Kerner and all these other guys in jail definitely cuts down on corruption.
When most people, including most people, the vast majority of people in Illinois don't understand, is that being a state senator or being a state whatever they call it, assembly person in Illinois is a terrific deal. It's a half-time job with a triple-time pension. And you get a cost of living boost on your pension by law year after year. Think about it. Think about why people go to the lengths they do in my state to remain in office until they can get that full pension. You would too.
Well, I think this has been a very worthwhile conversation. I am glad that there's disagreement. I think that the most important thing is that we are showing that people can talk, can get together and speak civilly and seek solutions. Some of these problems are clearly very, very tough to resolve. And the motivations that Mark points out are absolutely critical to understanding why some of these things don't change easily. Part of the reason that we got involved in election reform per se is because we recognized that a large part of the problem had to do with motivation for people wanting to get reelected and what was it that was driving them. Certainly, I think the idea of term limits is one that's getting more discussed than it had ever before, or at least in recent times. But it's also a stretch, and I think we're always trying to find the balance between what's achievable and what has real impact. And I think we'll continue to do that and welcome input from all of you in terms of what areas can be productive for our country, not necessarily for either party. Herb, do you want to wrap up any further? Because I think we're running out of time.
Well, I think so. We can ask for one last round of comments. If anybody wants to make another comment, we'll wrap it up soon. Just raise your hand and we'll call on you. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up. Anybody? Well, why don't we complete it now? That Paul, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I suppose most of the group knows that in order to have term limits at the federal level in Congress, you'd have to have a constitutional amendment. And the chances of that, I say, these days are close to nothing, close to zero. On the state level, I Well, I'd love to see the academic studies as to whether it's meant anything in the states where it's passed. I see very little, that we have some term limits on a local level in Florida, and I don't see that it's done very much at all, frankly, one way or the other.
Tom, did you want to add something?
I just want to say thank you. I was going to just sign off. So thank you very much, Herb. This has been fascinating and actually helped me, as I explained, get a new spin on things. But I think I'll look at the.
And just as a note for all of you, to mark on your calendars, January 11th, when we're going to have a session working with some of the folks from open primaries, but talking about how some of these reforms can be implemented and have been, how progress has been made in some states where these things have gone forward. So I hope we'll find that as a more results-oriented discussion rather than problem discussion. Thanks again to everyone, and have a happy and healthy Thanksgiving.
I saw that Jean-Louis had his hand up.
Oh, my goodness. Let's catch that.
Well, you caught me on off guard, Peter. I kind of put it down because Mike had not noticed, and neither did Herb. What I want to say is that it's not just, we should not just rely on two Democratic senators to. I don't. There's one reason why we are not making progress is that the Democrats, in pushing those omnibus bills, are not willing to negotiate with Republicans. In fact, the same thing happened with Obamacare. Obama made a gesture to invite Republicans to give their inputs, and then entirely disregarded them because the Republicans come with different views on things, and the Democrats reject those views. And if it is not true to say that Republicans are not willing to negotiate on things. They are, but that means the Democrats will have to reduce their ambitions and not prepare the country for a revolution, but do incremental policies which will help people in the country. And I think engaging Republicans would basically help to have better policies. But the Democrats reject the idea. That's a fundamental problem in my view.
I think it is time to wrap up if there are no other comments. So thank you all for joining us today, and we will see you next time.
Hope everybody's enjoying it as much as I am, Herb.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night, Peter.
Good night, Ken.